History is a graveyard of secrets, but some graves are deeper than others. In the spring of 1483, the most powerful throne in Europe wasn't lost on a battlefield. It was stolen in the silence of a royal journey. Thousands watched the procession, millions cheered for the boy king, but only a handful of men knew the truth. The crown was already changing hands in the shadows. Welcome to the beginning of a mystery that has haunted England for 500 years. If you are watching this right now, I want to ask you something. What really happened? Because every case you are about to hear has one thing in common. The investigation was closed. The file was sealed. And the truth was never found. These are the cases that detectives couldn't solve, that witnesses couldn't explain, and that official records couldn't account for. If you are someone who needs to know what really happened, you are in the right place. Subscribe to Unsolved Vault and join thousands of investigators uncovering the case's history left unfinished. Welcome back. This is Unsolved Vault. And today, we open a case that was never meant to stay closed. In the spring of 1483, England carried the appearance of order, though the surface had begun to crack. Edward IV had died unexpectedly, leaving behind a court draped in black cloth and lined with familiar faces that suddenly seemed uncertain of one another. Churches held solemn services, nobles traveled between estates, and royal banners hung above cities that had known his rule for 2 decades. Yet beneath the customs of mourning, quiet calculations had already begun. Men who had stood together for years now watched each other with unusual care. For ordinary people, the news arrived through bells, prayers, and fragments of conversation that moved from market stalls to tavern benches. Travelers brought different accounts, and each retelling carried its own color. The scent of damp earth mixed with smoke from cooking fires as communities paused to absorb the loss. Priests spoke of duty and faith, while merchants worried about roads and trade. Behind closed doors, servants overheard names whispered in cautious voices. Even those far from London sensed that something delicate had shifted inside the kingdom. As the days passed, messages moved across England with greater purpose. Riders arrived at noble houses before dawn, and letters crossed the countryside under careful protection. Powerful families began gathering allies, though few spoke openly about ambition. Attention slowly turned toward Edward's eldest son, the 12-year-old prince who was expected to become king. His future seemed clear in official statements, but private conversations often drifted elsewhere. Around him stood uncles, advisors, and loyal supporters, each carrying their own hopes into an uncertain season. To many observers, the moment felt larger than the death of one ruler. Edward IV had left behind children, brothers, rivals, and unfinished tensions that had never fully disappeared. Some believed the transition would pass peacefully, while others sensed hidden currents beneath the calm language of ceremony. There was no obvious sign of danger, only a quiet awareness that history sometimes changed in ways few people noticed at first. Long before questions surrounded 2 young princes, England itself had begun listening for answers it could not yet name. Beyond the walls of Westminster, the kingdom stretched across fields, rivers, and busy roads that had grown accustomed to Edward IV. For many years, his rule had brought a degree of stability after the long violence of the Wars of the Roses. Families planted crops with confidence, merchants expanded their businesses, and noble houses learned to navigate the balance of power that Edward carefully maintained. His death disturbed that balance in ways few could measure. The habits of daily life continued, yet uncertainty traveled quietly through every layer of society. At Ludlow Castle near the border of Wales, Edward's eldest son lived under the guidance of trusted officials. The young prince had spent much of his life preparing for kingship. Tutors shaped his education with lessons in religion, law, and royal conduct. Members of the Woodville family, relatives of his mother Elizabeth Woodville, surrounded him with loyalty and influence. Their presence gave the prince security, but it also caused unease among other powerful figures. Some nobles viewed the growing strength of the Woodvilles with suspicion, believing that too much authority rested in their hands. Far from Ludlow, another figure received the news of Edward IV's death. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was the king's younger brother and one of the most experienced men in England. He governed the north with efficiency and had earned a reputation for loyalty during years of conflict. In Edward's final arrangements, Richard had been named Lord Protector, a position meant to guide the kingdom until the young king reached adulthood. To some, this decision offered reassurance. To others, it introduced new questions. The balance between royal duty and personal ambition had often proved difficult in English history. Within London, the court itself became a place filled with guarded conversations. Servants carried messages through corridors where every word seemed heavier than before. Advisors gathered in chambers decorated with symbols of royal authority, yet no one could fully predict how events would unfold. Publicly, there were declarations of unity and promises of loyalty to the young Edward. Privately, different factions studied one another with growing caution. Friendships that had once appeared firm now carried traces of doubt. Beneath the mourning clothes and formal ceremonies, something less visible had begun to emerge. The struggle was not yet open, but its first shadows had already entered the kingdom. As spring deepened, attention slowly shifted toward the journey that would bring the young king to London. Tradition demanded that Edward V travel from Ludlow to the capital, where preparations for his coronation would eventually begin. On paper, the process appeared simple. The kingdom had witnessed royal transitions before, and ceremonies followed familiar patterns. Yet beneath the surface, different groups were already considering who would stand closest to the boy once he reached the throne. Influence around a child king could shape the future of England itself, and many understood the importance of that position. Elizabeth Woodville remained inside sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her younger children. It was a place of protection, respected by tradition and faith. Around her gathered relatives and supporters who feared that events outside their walls might move beyond their control. The Queen Mother had reason to be cautious. Her family had risen quickly during Edward IV's reign, gaining wealth and influence that others openly resented. Enemies had formed over many years, though smiles and ceremonies often concealed those feelings. In the uncertain days after the king's death, old rivalries seemed to awaken once more. Meanwhile, Richard of Gloucester began traveling south. He did not move alone. Beside him stood Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, a nobleman whose loyalty and ambition made him a valuable companion. Together they gathered support as they approached Northampton. Reports and messages moved ahead of them, creating a sense of expectation wherever they passed. Few people openly questioned Richard's authority as Lord Protector. His reputation had been built over years of service. Yet some observers noticed that trusted Woodville allies around the young king watched these developments with increasing concern. Polite exchanges masked deeper tensions that neither side wished to reveal too quickly. At Northampton, important figures finally came together. Lord Rivers, the king's uncle, and several supporters expected cooperation and orderly discussions. Instead, events unfolded in ways that surprised many present. Meetings ended with sudden arrests. Familiar faces found themselves separated from the prince they had sworn to protect. Official explanations spoke of security and loyalty, but rumors traveled faster than facts. Across England, fragments of information reached noble households and ordinary communities alike. People struggled to understand what had happened. The kingdom still recognized Edward V as king, yet strange developments had begun to surround him. Questions appeared long before answers, and uncertainty grew with every passing day. After the arrests at Northampton, the young king continued his journey under the protection of Richard of Gloucester. To many watching from a distance, the arrangement seemed reasonable. Richard was the king's uncle and the appointed Lord Protector. Public statements described the situation as orderly and necessary. Yet the sudden removal of trusted companions left a quiet sense of unease. News spread slowly across the kingdom, carried by travelers and letters that often arrived days apart. With every retelling, details changed slightly, and uncertainty deepened around events few people had witnessed directly. Along the roads leading toward London, towns prepared to welcome their new monarch. Church bells rang, banners were raised, and local officials organized formal greetings. Crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of the boy who would soon wear the crown. Some remembered Edward IV and searched for familiar features in his son. Others spoke with admiration about the future that awaited England. The prince himself appeared calm in public appearances, dressed with the dignity expected of a king. To ordinary people, there was little reason to imagine that hidden struggles surrounded the royal procession. Inside Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth Woodville watched developments with growing concern. The sanctuary offered safety, but it also isolated her from decisions unfolding beyond its walls. With her remained her younger son, Richard, Duke of York, and several daughters. Messengers brought information, though not always with certainty. Supporters advised patience, while rumors reached the Queen through servants and visitors. Each report carried different possibilities. She understood that power at court could shift quickly, and the protection of her children mattered above everything else. The future of her family now depended on choices made by men beyond her control. As London prepared for a coronation, conversations among noble families became increasingly cautious. Dates were discussed, arrangements were drafted, and ceremonies seemed close at hand. Yet beneath those preparations, questions quietly multiplied. Why had the prince's companions been removed so suddenly? Why were trusted figures disappearing from positions they once held with confidence? Some dismissed such concerns as natural tensions during a royal transition. Others sensed that something unusual was taking shape behind official announcements. The kingdom had entered a season filled with appearances of stability, but beneath that appearance, invisible currents were already guiding events toward a future no one could clearly see. By early May of 1483, London had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Markets remained busy, barges moved along the Thames, and the great churches continued their daily prayers. To visitors arriving from distant counties, the city appeared much as it always had. Yet behind the familiar sounds of trade and worship, important decisions were being shaped in private chambers. Noblemen entered meetings through side doors, trusted servants carried sealed letters, and every conversation seemed to carry more meaning than before. A kingdom waiting for a coronation had begun to feel strangely cautious. Richard of Gloucester established himself at the center of royal affairs with growing confidence. Few openly challenged his authority, and many believed his experience made him the right man to guide the young king. Officials continued their duties, and public declarations emphasized unity. Even so, not everyone shared the same sense of reassurance. Those connected to the Woodville family watched events with increasing anxiety, while other noble houses measured each development with careful attention. Alliances were rarely permanent in 15th century England. Loyalty and self-interest often traveled side by side, hidden beneath respectful words and formal gestures. Among ordinary people, certainty became difficult to find. News reached villages and towns in fragments, often changed by rumor before it arrived. One traveler claimed everything was peaceful. Another spoke of arrests and disagreements among powerful men. Priests offered prayers for stability, while merchants wondered how political unrest might affect trade. Most people knew little about the private struggles unfolding among the nobility, but they understood that the death of a king could alter lives far beyond the royal court. England had experienced civil conflict before, and memories of those troubled years had not completely faded. At the center of these growing uncertainties stood two young boys whose names carried enormous weight. Edward V had not yet been crowned, and his younger brother Richard remained inside sanctuary beside their mother. Neither child understood how deeply adults around them were calculating the future. The ceremonies of mourning had not yet ended, but something far larger had already begun. Beneath prayers, promises, and declarations of loyalty, quiet tensions moved through the kingdom like unseen currents beneath dark water. Long before the mystery of the princes emerged, England itself had entered a chapter filled with questions that no one yet knew how to answer. As the king's court whispered in shadows, a far more calculated movement was happening miles away. The real game wasn't being played in the capital. It was being played on the roads. In late April of 1483, the road from Ludlow stretched ahead beneath gray skies and early spring growth. 12-year-old Edward V traveled with a large household that reflected his rank and future position. Horses, wagons, guards, and attendants moved together across the countryside with careful order. Banners marked the presence of royalty, and noble companions rode close to the young king. Castles and manor houses offered shelter along the route, while church towers appeared in the distance above villages that paused to witness his passing. People along the roads experienced the journey in different ways. Farmers left their work to gather near hedges and bridges. Children stood beside their parents, hoping for a glimpse of the boy whose face they knew only from stories. The sound of hooves mixed with birdsong and the rustling of fresh leaves. Fires burned inside inns preparing meals for travelers, and church bells occasionally carried across the fields. For many who watched the procession, the season felt hopeful. A new reign seemed close, and the kingdom expected celebration. Yet small changes began to shape the journey. Messages arrived from distant places, and riders appeared carrying fresh news from London and the north. Discussions among senior figures became more private. Stops along the road took on greater importance than anyone had first imagined. At Stony Stratford and Northampton, meetings that seemed routine slowly gathered unexpected weight. Men who had traveled together for years found themselves separated by sudden decisions. The road toward a coronation remained open, but its purpose had begun to shift in ways few outside the royal circle understood. To observers who looked beyond ceremonies, the journey carried a strange feeling. Edward V appeared calm and dutiful, unaware that adults around him measured power as carefully as loyalty. What should have been remembered as a young king's welcome into history was already taking another shape. Roads and castles became places where unseen choices quietly altered the future. Looking back centuries later, it is difficult to escape the feeling that England had entered one story while believing it was living through another. The journey from Ludlow had been planned with care long before Edward IV died. As Prince of Wales, Edward V maintained his household near the Welsh border, where trusted officials supervised his education and daily affairs. The roads leading toward London were familiar to royal travelers, and preparations for the future king's arrival had already begun. Nothing about the route suggested danger. Noble families expected a smooth transition, and many believed England stood at the beginning of another stable reign. Yet certainty often appeared strongest just before events took an unexpected turn. Among those closest to the young king was Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, the brother of Queen Elizabeth Woodville. Educated and respected, Rivers had devoted years to guiding Edward's development. Beside him traveled Richard Grey, another member of the Queen's family. Together they formed part of a circle that expected to oversee the king's early years. Their influence seemed natural to supporters of the Woodville family, but others viewed the situation differently. Some noblemen feared that too much power would rest with the Queen's relatives. Old rivalries, never fully resolved, quietly shaped opinions across England. Meanwhile, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, received news that the young king had already begun his journey south. Named Lord Protector in Edward IV's final arrangements, Richard moved quickly from the north. He joined forces with Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, whose support strengthened his position. Publicly, both men declared loyalty to Edward V and emphasized their duty to protect the kingdom. Their actions appeared lawful and honorable. Yet behind official words stood larger concerns. Who would truly guide England during the years before the boy reached adulthood? That question mattered deeply, because influence over a child king often meant influence over the realm itself. As these separate groups moved across the country, their paths slowly approached one another. Travelers passed through villages carrying fragments of information, though few understood the significance of what lay ahead. Inns welcomed noble guests, servants prepared chambers, and ordinary routines continued around events that would later draw endless attention. Nothing dramatic announced itself to the people watching from a distance. There were no signs of open conflict. Yet two different visions of authority had begun moving toward the same destination. Somewhere along those roads, beneath polite words and royal customs, the future course of England was quietly changing. By the end of April, the two parties drew closer to one another. Edward V and his companions reached Northampton, expecting to meet Richard of Gloucester in an atmosphere of cooperation. There was little reason for alarm. Richard was not only the king's uncle, but also a respected figure whose military service and years of loyalty had earned trust throughout England. Noble customs required courtesy and unity during moments like these. Publicly, everyone spoke the language of duty. Behind those careful words, however, different expectations quietly occupied the minds of the men preparing to meet. The evening at Northampton unfolded with warmth and ceremony. Richard and Buckingham welcomed Earl Rivers with friendly conversation, shared meals, and assurances of mutual purpose. Nothing in their behavior suggested what would follow. Servants moved through candlelit rooms carrying food and wine, while horses rested in nearby stables after long days of travel. Guests retired believing that the business of the kingdom would continue as planned. The atmosphere felt ordinary, almost comforting. Yet history often hides its sharpest turns behind familiar scenes, and dawn would reveal that appearances could change with startling speed. The next morning brought decisions that few expected. Richard ordered the arrest of Earl Rivers, Richard Grey, and several close supporters of the Woodville family. Charges and accusations were presented, though the full reasons remained unclear to many observers. The sudden action shattered assumptions that had guided the journey from Ludlow. Men who had accompanied the young king found themselves removed from his side without warning. Confusion spread quickly among servants and attendants who struggled to understand what had happened. Edward V himself was left separated from trusted figures who had helped guide him for years. Soon afterward, Richard traveled to Stony Stratford, where the young king waited. Accounts describe the meeting as respectful and calm. Edward greeted his uncle with proper courtesy, unaware of the deeper tensions surrounding him. Richard explained that certain men had betrayed the kingdom and that their removal had been necessary. The 12-year-old king accepted these words with the obedience expected of a child raised to respect authority. Together they resumed the journey toward London. To those watching from outside, the procession continued. Yet the faces surrounding the king had changed, and with them, something far more important had changed as well. After Stony Stratford, the journey continued under a different atmosphere. Edward V remained surrounded by noble attendants and armed escorts, but many familiar faces had disappeared. Richard of Gloucester now occupied the central position beside the young king, and his authority appeared unquestioned. Official messages described recent events as necessary acts carried out for the safety of the realm. Those explanations satisfied some observers. Others struggled to understand why men who had once stood close to the king had vanished so suddenly. Answers were difficult to find, and uncertainty often filled the spaces where facts should have been. As the royal company traveled south, people gathered with the same curiosity they had shown before. Villagers lined the roads, merchants paused their work, and local officials offered respectful greetings. To ordinary eyes, the future king appeared healthy and composed. Edward wore the dignity expected of his position, and his uncle presented himself as a loyal protector. The ceremonies of welcome continued as though nothing unusual had occurred. Yet travelers carried stories from one town to another, and those stories rarely agreed. Rumors began taking shape, changing with every voice that repeated them. Within noble circles, conversations became increasingly careful. Some believed Richard had acted wisely to prevent dangerous influences from controlling the king. Others worried that the arrests signaled something larger. Men who had once spoken openly now measured every sentence. Letters were written with caution, and trusted messengers became more valuable than public announcements. Across England, alliances shifted quietly beneath the surface. Nobody wished to stand on the wrong side of events that remained difficult to understand. The uncertainty itself became a source of tension, because few people knew where the recent changes would eventually lead. When the royal procession finally approached London, anticipation mixed with quiet unease. Preparations for the coronation continued, and the city expected to welcome its young king with proper ceremony. Edward V had completed the journey he began at Ludlow, yet the experience had altered more than his surroundings. The path toward the throne had introduced unexpected divisions and hidden fears. Looking back through the centuries, it is striking how little attention many people paid to these moments at the time. They believed they were watching the beginning of a reign. History would remember them differently. On May 4, 1483, Edward V entered London with the dignity expected of a king. Crowds gathered along the streets, eager to witness the arrival of the 12-year-old ruler whose name already appeared on official documents. Church bells sounded across the city, and noblemen prepared for ceremonies that would lead toward his coronation. The young king rode beside his uncle, Richard of Gloucester, who carried the responsibility of Lord Protector. To many watching from windows and market squares, the scene appeared reassuring. England seemed to be following the familiar path of royal succession. Yet beneath the celebrations, subtle differences shaped the atmosphere around the court. Men who had accompanied Edward from Ludlow were absent. New advisors occupied places of influence, and servants noticed unfamiliar faces moving through royal residences. Messages arrived daily, and meetings stretched late into the evening. Public announcements emphasized harmony and stability, but private discussions carried another tone. Questions circulated among noble households, though few dared to speak openly. Everyone understood that power rarely stood empty for long. Whoever guided the young king would help shape the future of the kingdom itself. Edward V was housed inside the Tower of London, which at the time served not only as a fortress but also as a traditional residence for monarchs awaiting coronation. His arrival there caused little concern among the public. Kings had followed the same custom before him. Preparations for the coronation moved forward, and expectations remained focused on the ceremony ahead. The young ruler appeared calm and respectful, surrounded by attendants who maintained the routines expected at court. Nothing about his circumstances seemed unusual to most people. The journey from Ludlow had ended, and another chapter appeared ready to begin. But roads often reveal their meaning only after travelers have left them behind. What began as a procession toward celebration had quietly transformed into something far more uncertain. Along inns, castles, and crossroads, decisions had been made that changed the people surrounding the king. Few recognized the importance of those moments while they unfolded. The journey itself had become more than a passage across England. It had become the opening movement of a mystery that would survive centuries. Behind the banners and ceremonies, invisible struggles had already placed the kingdom on a path that no one could fully understand. But who was truly pulling the strings behind the mask of a loyal protector? It was time to look closer at the man who claimed he was only acting for the safety of the realm. Richard of Gloucester cut a striking figure in the political world of late 15th century England. As the younger brother of Edward IV, he held lands across the north and governed them with discipline and experience. Noblemen, soldiers, and officials knew his name long before the crisis of 1483 began. His household included loyal servants and trusted companions who had remained beside him through years of conflict. While others gathered influence at court, Richard built his authority far from London, surrounded by castles, estates, and men whose loyalty had been tested. Those who entered Richard's world encountered an atmosphere shaped by order and purpose. Messengers arrived with reports from distant towns, clerks copied documents by candlelight, and armed retainers moved through stone halls carrying out daily duties. Meals were shared with advisors who understood the language of politics and war. Conversations often mixed practical matters with larger concerns about the kingdom. Visitors sensed confidence within his circle, but also caution. Every letter, every meeting, and every promise carried weight in a country where old rivalries had never fully disappeared. After Edward IV died, the rhythm around Richard changed noticeably. Requests for guidance increased, and familiar names began appearing more frequently beside his own. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, drew closer, while other supporters gathered around the man now named Lord Protector. Decisions came quickly as Richard moved south toward the center of events. Men who had spent years working within his household suddenly found themselves involved in matters that affected the entire kingdom. The network around him expanded, and with that growth came opportunities that few could have imagined only weeks earlier. To some observers, Richard represented stability during a dangerous transition. Others looked at the same man and saw something harder to understand. His loyalty to Edward IV had been clear for years. Yet power often changed the meaning of familiar relationships. Historians still debate where duty ended and ambition began. Looking back across the centuries, what stands out most is not certainty, but the strange tension surrounding a figure who inspired trust and suspicion at the same time. Richard stood close to the center of events, and the shadows around him were already beginning to deepen. Long before the events of 1483 placed him under suspicion, Richard of Gloucester had built a reputation through years of service. Born in 1452 during the violence of the Wars of the Roses, he spent much of his early life surrounded by uncertainty. His family endured exile, defeat, and constant danger before Edward IV secured the throne. Those experiences shaped Richard in ways that later observers often considered important. Unlike many nobles who inherited peaceful lives, he matured in a world where loyalty could mean survival and where political fortunes changed with alarming speed. As an adult, Richard became one of his brother's most dependable supporters. He fought beside Edward IV in military campaigns and helped defend the Yorkist cause during periods of renewed conflict. His influence grew steadily, particularly in northern England, where he gained respect from local communities and noble families. Records from the period suggest that many people viewed him as an effective administrator. Petitions reached his court, disputes were settled under his authority, and his reputation for fairness earned genuine praise. To those who knew only this side of Richard, later accusations seemed difficult to reconcile with the man they remembered. Around him stood a group of individuals whose loyalty stretched back many years. Francis Lovell became one of his closest companions, sharing political ambitions and personal trust. Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, provided support in the north, while numerous knights and retainers strengthened Richard's influence. These relationships mattered because power in 15th century England rarely rested on one person alone. Success depended on networks of trust, favors, and obligations carefully maintained over time. Richard understood that reality well. His circle did not emerge suddenly in 1483. It had been forming quietly across decades of service and shared interests. Yet even respected men attracted enemies. At the royal court, some viewed Richard's growing influence with concern. Members of the Woodville family, whose power increased after Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, represented a different center of authority. Their rise created tensions that remained hidden beneath ceremonies and public smiles. Richard and the Woodvilles worked together when necessary, but suspicion lingered beneath the surface. Years before Edward IV died, competing interests had already shaped relationships inside the kingdom. When the crisis finally arrived, those old divisions would matter far more than anyone openly admitted. When Edward IV died unexpectedly in April 1483, Richard of Gloucester found himself in a position unlike any he had occupied before. His brother's final arrangements named him Lord Protector, entrusting him with the care of the kingdom until Edward V reached adulthood. The title carried enormous responsibility, but it also brought dangers. A child king meant that others would compete for influence, and Richard understood that powerful families rarely surrendered opportunities willingly. As news spread across England, he faced a moment that demanded quick decisions, though history would later question the motives behind them. Richard moved south from his northern lands with purpose. Beside him rode Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, whose support strengthened his authority. Their journey was marked by formal declarations of loyalty to Edward V and repeated promises to preserve order. Many noblemen accepted those assurances without hesitation. Richard's years of service had earned trust, and few expected open conflict. Yet within his circle, discussions grew increasingly focused on the influence of the Woodville family. Some advisors feared that the Queen's relatives would dominate the government if left unchecked. Those concerns shaped conversations that outsiders rarely heard. The meetings at Northampton and Stony Stratford revealed how much confidence Richard placed in his own judgment. After welcoming Earl Rivers with outward courtesy, he ordered the arrests of Rivers, Richard Grey, and several others connected to the Woodvilles. The sudden actions shocked many observers. Richard insisted that dangerous plots threatened the kingdom and that immediate measures were necessary. Members of his circle supported those claims and acted without hesitation. Their unity demonstrated something important. Richard was not operating alone. Around him stood men willing to trust his decisions, even when those decisions carried enormous consequences. To supporters, these events proved that Richard possessed the strength required to protect England during uncertain times. Critics, however, began seeing a different picture. They wondered whether loyalty and ambition had become difficult to separate. Some questioned why arrests came so quickly, and why old allies disappeared from positions of influence. Answers remained hidden behind official explanations and carefully chosen words. What seemed clear was that Richard's circle had become more powerful with every passing day. As the young king continued toward London, the men surrounding his uncle were quietly shaping events that would echo through history long after their own voices had faded. As Richard settled into his role as Lord Protector, the people closest to him became increasingly important. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, stood beside him with remarkable loyalty during the spring of 1483. Francis Lovell remained another trusted figure, offering support that extended beyond ordinary political alliances. Clerks, lawyers, and household officers carried out instructions that connected Richard's authority to every corner of the kingdom. Together, these men formed a network that operated with discipline and confidence. Their cooperation gave Richard stability at a moment when uncertainty surrounded nearly every major decision. Meetings inside royal residences and noble houses became places where influence quietly gathered. Documents passed between hands, messengers traveled through the countryside, and advisors discussed matters that rarely reached public ears. Richard relied heavily on individuals whose loyalty had been proven over years rather than months. That approach reflected the lessons of his own life. He had witnessed betrayal during the Wars of the Roses and understood how quickly fortunes could collapse. Trust was never offered lightly. Those admitted into his inner circle occupied positions earned through experience, family ties, or years of dependable service. Not everyone welcomed the growing strength of this group. Noble families outside Richard's circle watched developments with increasing caution. Some accepted his authority and believed stability depended on supporting the Lord Protector. Others wondered whether too much power was concentrating around a small group of allies. Conversations inside castles and manor houses became more guarded. Men who once spoke freely began weighing every opinion. Letters were written with careful language, and rumors multiplied in the absence of clear answers. The more Richard relied on trusted companions, the more outsiders questioned what those companions hoped to achieve. Centuries later, historians continue examining these relationships because they reveal something deeper than political alliances. Richard himself remains difficult to define, but the men around him offer clues to the world he trusted. Some researchers see loyalty and shared responsibility. Others detect ambition hidden beneath honorable language. Both interpretations find support within surviving records. What makes the story so compelling is the absence of certainty. Richard of Gloucester stood at the center of events, but he never stood alone. Around him gathered individuals whose decisions and beliefs became part of a mystery that history has never fully untangled. As the weeks passed, Richard of Gloucester found himself surrounded by growing expectations and growing doubts. Publicly, he continued to speak as the loyal uncle and protector of Edward V. Official business moved through his hands, and many nobles accepted his leadership as necessary during a difficult transition. Yet outside those formal duties, questions quietly gathered. The arrests at Stony Stratford had changed the balance of power. Men once close to the young king had disappeared from influence, while Richard's own companions occupied positions of increasing importance. Few people could ignore the changing shape of authority. Among those who observed events from a distance, opinions about Richard varied sharply. Supporters praised his experience and believed his actions prevented dangerous factions from controlling the government. Critics saw something more troubling. They wondered why every development seemed to strengthen the Lord Protector and weaken his rivals. Such suspicions remained difficult to prove, but they spread through noble circles with surprising speed. Ambition had shaped English politics for generations, and many people knew that loyalty and self-interest often shared the same language. Richard's intentions became a subject of quiet discussion long before accusations emerged openly. Inside his own circle, confidence remained strong. Buckingham, Lovell, and other trusted supporters stood firmly beside him. Their cooperation suggested that they believed Richard's course served both the kingdom and their own interests. Decisions continued to flow from a group that had become increasingly united. Whether motivated by conviction, loyalty, or opportunity, these men acted with purpose. Together they guided events while much of England waited for a coronation that seemed close at hand. Few recognized how rapidly circumstances were changing. The focus remained on the future king, while attention slowly shifted toward the uncle entrusted with protecting him. Looking back across the centuries, Richard of Gloucester remains one of history's most complicated figures. He appears in records as a devoted brother, an experienced ruler, a capable soldier, and eventually a man surrounded by suspicion. His allies, his choices, and his rise to power continue to inspire debate among historians and ordinary readers alike. Perhaps that uncertainty explains why his story refuses to fade. Richard stood at the center of one of England's greatest mysteries, and even before the fate of the princes became uncertain, the questions surrounding their uncle had already begun taking shape in the shadows. The stage was set, the boy was isolated, and the path to the throne was nearly clear. But Richard of Gloucester had one final, impossible obstacle standing between him and absolute power: the Queen's sanctuary. How do you trap a king who is already hidden inside the most sacred walls in England? The answer will change everything. We dive into the confrontation that broke the law of the land in just 48 hours.